Hi, it's Professor Charlie Evans, and today I want to talk a little bit about Kievan Rus, the origins of civilization in Russia. And of course, I'm wearing my Viking hat. It's not really a Viking hat, but it's kind of a symbolic Viking hat. And you may wonder what's the connection between a Viking hat and a lecture on ancient Russia. But of course, the whole issue is the actual origins of Russia and the connection between Russia and Scandinavia. How much of a role did Vikings or Varangians or Normans, as they're sometimes called, play in the origins of a organized political state in ancient Russia? As a historian, the main difficulty with studying early Russia is a lack of sources. The key source that we usually rely on is often called the Russian Primary Chronicle, or the Povest Временных Let, also called the Tale of Bygone Years. And this is a chronicle composed by monks which dates to the 12th century. Now that's problematic because the events described by the chronicle go from the 9th century, the 800s, to the 12th century. And so the chronicle itself dates hundreds of years after the events being described by the chronicle. So that's problem number one with the chronicle, the primary chronicle, which you're going to be reading excerpts of in the course. The fact that it's written after the fact for the most part. The other problem is, of course, that it was written by monks, so of course it represents a specific intent on the part of the monks with the way they describe events and ascribe importance to certain events. And the third problem with the primary chronicle is that it doesn't exist anymore. The originals are long lost, and so what scholars rely on are secondary kind of sources or later versions of the primary chronicle. And so that really makes it difficult to study early Russian history. And so a lot of our knowledge about what occurred in the 9th and earlier centuries in Russia is derived from archaeological evidence. Now, also consider that when we talk about early Russian history, we usually refer to Rus as opposed to Russia. And Rus geographically refers to the extent of the state as it existed in really the 10th and 11th centuries, the high point of early Rus. And this encompassed the region from the lower part of the Baltic Ocean down to the Black Sea. And more specifically, we could really focus on the Dnieper River, the most important city of which is founded along the river, the Dnieper River, is Kiev. And so when we talk about early Russian history, early Rus, we're really focusing on the state that existed around Kiev. Kievan Rus is often another alternative term for early Russian history. So we talked about the difficulties of working with the chronicle. I've also mentioned that the early state was centered on Kiev itself. The founding of the state is where the controversy arises. And specifically, what was the role of Vikings or invaders or migrants from Scandinavia? What was their role in organizing and creating a unified political state? And in the words of the primary chronicle, which you're going to be reading, the text goes something like, the early Slavic tribes, there was disorder, there was no order amongst the tribes, and so it was decided, let us invite from abroad these Viking brothers to come and create a political state. I'm paraphrasing a lot there. But when you think about it, you think about how improbable that really is. That tribes, the Slavic tribes, Slavic societies, whatever, would willingly invite foreigners speaking a different language, with different customs, different social customs, different organization and political customs, to come and rule over them on a voluntary basis. They come and rule us. From a practical point of view, I find that really improbable. But that's what the Chronicle says, and that's what historians have been arguing about for the last 200, 250 years, about how accurate that is and what exactly was the role of the Vikings in the creation of this early Kievan Russian state. So, the importance of the primary chronicle, the state organized around the city of Kiev, the trade routes up and down the Dnieper River from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the role or non-role of the Vikings, the Varangians, in creating this state. And lastly, we get to the importance of the rule of Vladimir. 980 to 1015, clearly the most important figure in early Russian history, and the single most important event connected with his reign was the adoption of Christianity in 988. Now, let's put that into context with Christianity in Europe. In Charlemagne's reign, let's just say 800 for our purposes here, 800, the beginning of the 9th century, Charlemagne waged extensive wars against non-Christian peoples in Europe to Christianize them. And he ended up bringing Christianity to a lot of people in Europe. And so in this case, we have Christianity reaching the Slavic tribes of Kievan, what would become Kievan Russia, only in the later 10th century. So that's really that's really a big time lag from when Christianity reached most of European peoples to when it finally reached Europe. When it did reach Europe, it of course reached, when it did reach Russia, it of course reached Russia in the form of Christianity from the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Orthodox, and it's described in the primary chronicle, Vladimir's selection of Christianity, how he saw representatives from the Pope, from Eastern Orthodox, from Islam, and they decided upon Orthodox Christianity as the version that to be adopted in Russia. But it's also important to note the role of the prince. I mean, the people of Russia didn't decide on adopting Christianity. It was a prince who decided on adopting Christianity. Even though he consulted with his boyar advisors, it was the prince who decided. And that was pretty much how Christianity spread throughout Europe. I mean, people didn't adopt Christianity. Their rulers, their kings, their princes adopted Christianity, usually for very specific political reasons, for power reasons. And then the prince or king said, we are all Christian now and you will be Christian. And the people were Christianized and everything. And in the Russian case, in Kiev, the people were herded down to the river and thrown into the river, and water was sprinkled on them, and they were Christians. They were suddenly Orthodox Christians. Now when you think about it, none of the people could read. Christianity in many cases was a language of Latin or Greek, which is not what the language of the people were. And so it was a really kind of bizarre way that these early people adopted Christianity, and as they adopted Christianity, they kind of merged Christianity with their local rituals, customs, and religious ideas, and it kind of all fused together. But nonetheless, in 988, Vladimir adopted Christianity. Early Rus became a Christian nation, became closely associated with Byzantium, because that was, Eastern Orthodox was a religion of Byzantium. And so Russia became part of the Christian concert of nations. That was 988, the end of the 10th century. Kievan Rus, we really kind of lengthened out the boundaries of it to maybe 1100. And after that, the state fragmented because of division of the state amongst brothers, and over time it gradually became weaker and weaker. And it was much later that the center of Russian civilization moved from Kiev, in what is now present-day Ukraine, to what became Moscow in the further heartland of what became Russia. And so, let me just check my notes here if there's anything else I wanted to say about early Rus. I think that pretty much sums it up. And so look at, if you remember my Viking hat, you'll remember that this is one of the most persistent questions about early Russian history, is this connection between the founding of the first Russian state, centered around Kiev, and the role of Vikings, or sometimes called Varangians or Normans, in the foundation of that state. And all this is documented by the primary chronicle, our important source, the chronicle itself, of course, which has problems surrounding its use and interpretation. Okay, thanks.